Hello and welcome to Carol and Duffy's in Mrs. Tilscher's class analysis for the SEA GCSE English Literature Poetry Identity Anthology. So the first thing I like to do when I look at a poem is consider the title and how the title impacts my interpretation of the poem. So this title is very clearly about a teacher. So my expectations as soon as I look at it are this teacher obviously made a massive impression, potentially a positive one, and it really firmly grounds the poem in the setting. I know that it's going to be about school, maybe about education, definitely about their childhood and their memories. So I want you to consider, how do teachers shape our identities as young people? Can you think of a really memorable teacher? Maybe in class you want to share some stories. I have a really strong, vivid memory of this fantastically sarcastic English teacher called Mrs. Fulton that was teaching in Lurgan College when I was doing my GCSEs. I don't want to talk too much about her, I'll save that for class, but she was a fantastic woman who really inspired my love of literature. What was it that made her so memorable? Well, I'll tell you in class, but I'm sure you have your own really memorable teachers, maybe some from primary school, and maybe some of these people actually shaped your identity. Maybe they inspired a love of creative writing, maybe they got you really interested in sports, maybe they made you realise how fascinating of a subject history is. So I just want to take a minute to read the poem. You could travel up the Blue Nile with your finger, tracing the route, while Mrs. Tilscher chanted the scenery. Tana, Ethiopia, Khartoum, Aswan. That for an hour, then a skittle of milk, and the chalky pyramids rubbed into dust. A window opened with a long pole. The laugh of a bell swung by a running child. This was better than home. Enthralling books. The classroom glowed like a sweet shop. Sugar paper, coloured shapes, Brady and Hindley, faded like the faint, uneasy smudge of a mistake. Mrs. Tilscher loved you. Some mornings you found she'd left a good gold star by your name. The scent of a pencil, slowly, carefully sharpened. A xylophone's nonsense heard from another form. Over the Easter term, the inky tadpoles changed from commas into exclamation marks. 3 frogs hopped in the playground, freed by a dunce, followed by a line of kids jumping and croaking away from the lunch queue. A rough boy told you how you were born. You kicked him, but stared at your parents, appalled, when you got back home. That feverish July, the air tasted of electricity. A tangible alarm made you always untidy, hot, fractious under the heavy, sexy sky. You asked her how you were born, and Mrs. Tilscher smiled, then turned away. Reports were handed out. You ran through the gates, impatient to be grown, as the sky split open into a thunderstorm. So just to make you aware that there is actually a little mistake in the formatting of this, and this was better than home, enthralling books, is actually where stanza 2 starts. On this slide, there are quite a few questions which I found from a teaching resource on the internet, and I thought it was really helpful. So they have tasked you with reading the poem and answering the questions after looking at it in your anthology using a technique called Pearl, which is kind of like your point evidence explain or point evidence analysis or petal or T or whatever variation you have been taught. To help you with your paragraph structure. So Pearl, point evidence analysis, reader response, link back to the question. It could be point evidence technique analysis, link back to the question. It's up to you, okay? So why might Duffy have chosen to write the poem in the second person? In the first stanza, do you think the children understand what they are learning? And again, where's your evidence? In the second stanza, how does Duffy show her positive attitudes towards school? How is the image of the tadpoles relevant to the main themes of the poem? How does Mrs. Tilscher finally disappoint Duffy? And how does Duffy use language to appeal to the senses? So just to help you with that, there is an exemplar. Again, I did not write this, but it is an exemplar Pearl analysis for the first question, why might Duffy have chosen to write the poem in the second person? And this candidate has written, Duffy may have chosen to write the poem in the second person to encourage the reader to empathise with its themes. Lines like Mrs. Tilscher loved you, and the imagery in the simile, the classroom glowed like a sweet shop, are childlike observations and evoke positive memories and feelings of how safe and happy they felt in the school environment as children. Through this personal involvement, the reader is therefore as shocked as the poet when the tone of the poem suddenly changes alongside the poet's realisation that her parents and teachers have lied to her and the world is not quite as it seemed. The use of the second person effectively places you within the poem and encourages you to personally engage with both the themes portrayed and the feelings implied. So if you want to use this to shape your answer to the first one, and then use this kind of pearl scaffold to answer the rest of the questions. Now we are getting onto the section where we really consider the teacher notes. My context is Caroline Duffy was born in 1955. She's a Scottish poet and she's currently the UK's first ever female and first Scottish poet laureate. She was born in Glasgow. She moved with her family to Stafford when she was 7, where she was educated. She wrote poetry from an early age and was first published at the age of 15, and she has since written plays, critical works, and several volumes of poetry. Her poetry has been the subject of controversy. She follows the poetic tradition of, for example, Robert Browning in writing monologues from the point of view of disturbed characters. Her poem Education for Leisure caused a huge debate when an exam board decided to withdraw it from an exam syllabus because of a complaint about its contents. Duffy often tackles quite difficult subjects, and she really encourages the reader to explore alternative viewpoints. Her poetry is often feminist in its themes and approach. Her collection, The World's Wife, took characters from history, literature, and mythology and gave them a female point of view as a sister, a wife, or a feminised version of a character. In this poem, Duffy draws upon her own experiences of primary school in Britain in the 1960s, a time when children were still caned, wore dunces' hats, and received free milk. Also a period in which Britain was horrified by news of Moors murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, who abducted and murdered children, burying their bodies in the moors above Manchester. The reference to Brady and Hindley sets the poem at around the 1950s to 60s, as they would have featured greatly in the news at this time. Now, if we consider the situation of the poem explores a young child growing up with a nurturing primary school environment. Mrs. Tilscher, from the poem's title, is portrayed as a loving teacher who has a profound effect on her pupils. This poem is drawn from Duffy's own experience, so you could say it's autobiographical, because Mrs. Tilscher was a real teacher who taught Caroline Duffy in her last year at junior school, and therefore the use of the personal pronoun you places her back into the past as she recalls her positive memories of school. However, it also enables you, the reader, to identify with her experience, drawing you into the poem and really making it a very universal experience. Duffy uses different times of year to represent the stages in the child's journey towards adolescence, so it represents this kind of transition from childhood to adolescence or to maybe puberty, and explore the concept of rites of passage. It explores the concept of identity and indeed changing identity over time, and how our teachers and peers can enable us to learn things which change us. Duffy conjures a classroom from the past by mentioning chalk and a skittle of milk. The reference to Brady and Hindley, the Moors murders, serial killers, sets the poem in the 1960s. It sets the poem at around the 50s, 60s actually, as they would have featured greatly in the news during this time. The delight of Mrs. Tilscher's class seems to protect the children from the insalubrious outside world. And that's another way of really saying run down or seedy. So this idea of this unsavoury adult world encroaching upon the innocent childlike or childhood one. But this does not last forever. The children grow and move towards adolescence, where they experience new feelings and sensations, and ultimately they leave Mrs. Tilscher behind. Duffy associates the oppressive feeling that we have in humid weather with the physical changes of puberty. Leaving primary school for the last time is like an escape we are eager to make, but which takes us from safety into a dangerous unknown. Throughout the poem, Duffy refers to you, meaning herself as she was in Mrs. Tilscher's class in the 1960s, but by writing it in the second person, she invites us to share her experience. Most readers will have the experience like the ones that Duffy's actually describing in the poem. Evaluation of the title. So the title lets the reader know the poet considers the school and teachers a massive part of shaping identity. It prepares the reader for the theme of school or childhood experience of growing up and suggests where the poem will be set. Duffy shows us the safe, comfortable world of early school years. Now considering the form and structure, so the narrative point of view, I've told you before, it's a second person point of view, depicting the universality of growing up and how our school years are integral to shaping our identities. If we look at this poem from an autobiographical standpoint, we can argue that it shows the child maturing into a great poet, especially as we see this world of imagination explored through all this really rich sensory language throughout. And the childlike world helps her express her ideas personally to the reader. 4 stanzas could potentially represent 4 school terms, or maybe just in a more general concept, the idea of aging. The first 2 stanzas have an even 8 lines describing the positive atmosphere of the primary school classroom. Stanzas 3 and 4 introduce the theme of change and growing up, and they have 7 lines. And this could reflect the destabilising nature of adolescence and the fact that sometimes children are in a hurry to grow up, only to be disappointed at the loss of their childhood innocence. Or it could just be suggesting that when you get older, time passes by much more quickly. The poem has this kind of conversational structure, 2 stanzas of 8 and then 2 of 7, and it's in more or less unrhymed pentameters. There's a very effective contrast between the first half of the poem and the last 2 stanzas as one moves from childhood security to dangerous growing up, matched by a movement from images of the classroom and school to natural phenomena, your tadpoles, frogs, weather, the outside, the security of Mrs. Tilscher's classroom. The poem gives specific details from the poet's childhood, but it records an almost universal experience. Now for our stanza by stanza analysis, I am not going to go through it line by line again because I know that I already read it to you and you've probably already read it yourselves a couple of times, but do note that there is some colour coding. So the first stanza has no real hint of what is to come. Duffy shows us a typical day in Mrs. Tilscher's class. While the children trace the route with their fingers on a map, the teacher tells them the names of the places on the Blue Nile. After an hour comes playtime and a bottle of milk, a tradition which was abolished by Mrs. Thatcher when she was Secretary of State for Education. Other familiar images from school are the window pole and the handbell. The laugh of a bell swung by a running child may be what is known as a transferred epithet. It is this child or others, but not the bell, who will be laughing at the end of the lesson. Alternatively, laughing might be a metaphor for the vigorous ringing of the bell, in which case you could say that it's personification because the bell isn't laughing as such. Bells can't laugh. Again, highlighting the fun and laughter of this educational setting, so of this classroom, and it shows the children's excitement and enjoyment, or maybe their thirst for knowledge even. There's a personal pronoun which suggests Duffy seems to be addressing herself, immersing herself in the memory, creating a tone of awe at the memory, but also shows us to view this experience, or allows us to view this experience as something universal. The verb choice, chanted, the scenery, chanted, describes the small details of the school day, depicting it as pleasant and shows the enthusiasm of this teacher and the children. We get a really strong sense of how passionate Mrs. Tilscher is through that sensory imagery, which in this case is oral, so you can hear, it's almost onomatopoeic, chanted. The single word sentences and this listing brings the setting alive. The children don't fully understand what they're learning, but they are enjoying her enthusiasm. The choice of diction, that, is a determiner, suggesting the routine of school life, but it isn't boring. More small details when we learn that this was done for an hour. There's a welcoming metaphor in the skittle of milk, and association with games suggests the fun, playful element to their school day. The adjective chalky creates a beautiful visual image of how lifelike she made everything, and the fact that the pyramids are rubbed into dust, obviously referring to the fact that she had drawn the pyramids on the board, but then obviously that idea of when you rub the chalk off, it's dusty, almost like the pyramids, emphasises again how vivid this experience is. Then you've got the laugh and the bell swinging and the running child, the verbs establishing an uplifting and carefree world where the children are free to grow and find themselves within a setting. Visual and oral imagery combined to really bring this classroom alive in this first stanza. Moving on to stanza 2. Better than home may seem odd, especially to readers from welcoming homes with lots to do, but Duffy means that there was more to do and satisfy an intelligent child's imagination than in her home. The bright colours would be more exciting than home decoration. Although Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, the so-called Moors murders of the 1960s, have become notorious for their child murders, real children at the time were not necessarily very aware and probably not afraid of them, and in school any fears would disappear. Duffy likens this fading of fear to the fading of a faint smudge where one corrects a mistake written in pencil, and the children think that their teacher loves them and see a good gold star on their work as proof of this. The assertion, "this was better than home," shows how enjoyable it was. The past tense generates a sense of sadness at growing up, so maybe there's a little bit of nostalgia here. And we see the security the school offers the child. She feels protected. The comparative better further emphasises this feeling of being loved, cherished and protected. The adjective emphasises the elements of the school experience which she found enjoyable. You could even call it emotive language, revealing her love of learning which was nurtured in the classroom. The simile, glued like a sweet shop, creates a joyful visual image for a child, and we can imagine the colour or vibrancy of this classroom. Sugar paper coloured shapes, well-loved memories brought to mind through the concrete nouns, and she uses listing to document her surroundings and the simple things that transport the child into a magical world, and the caesura creates a reflective, nostalgic tone. Again, you've got your topical allusion and your simile and your juxtaposition of those harsh outside adult world things encroaching on all this colour and vibrancy and security and innocence of the childhood world of the classroom. Emphasises how this outside world is not part of their world. The simile shows the joy of the classroom, helping them escape unpleasant reminders of a cruel adult world. Mrs. Tilscher's classroom makes them feel safe, and note that the simile uses imagery associated with school. The emphatic tone here emphasises how protected and cherished the children feel by their teacher, or Duffy feels by her teacher, that Mrs. Tilscher loved you. Good gold star, alliteration and assonance emphasises the pride of the child for this achievement and mimics how the teacher would have said it. The sibilance and use of adverbs evoke pleasant school memories and creates olfactory imagery. In fact, there's almost synesthesia here. You can almost smell the image that's being described. Depicting the sensual image of how devoted the teacher is to her job, further emphasised through the use of caesura in this line. The line's actually prolonged. Pencil slowly, carefully shaved, and that mimics the act of sharpening the pencil really slowly. And you've got your oral imagery and personification, emphasising the joy and happiness in the school setting, and it evokes school memories of learning being fun and appealing. Moving on to stanza 3. In the first half of the poem, there is no sense of time passing, but this comes in the second half. Note the proper noun and how it shows that time seems to be speeding up, reflecting the anxiousness of the child to grow up. The growth of the tadpoles is explained in terms of punctuation marks, about which the children would have learned in Mrs. Tilscher's class. So this idea of changing and growing uses this kind of almost educational landscape to chart it. The imagery of growth and school are combined. The natural world shows inevitable change, growing like the children. Accurate, detailed descriptions of the changing of shape. And again, it really emphasises how vivid this memory is and how obviously she felt it was really important to shaping her identity. There's a change in focus, showing a clear indication of the passage of time. Things seem to be moving on. The imagery of punctuation charts their learning. The action of the dunce in letting the frogs out hints at trouble to come. The children are amused, but not concerned for the animals today. Maybe this might be a different scenario. And most definitely, no child would be called a dunce in today's educational environment, a word which really strongly places the poem in the 1960s. Passage of time gains momentum. The noun choice places the poem in the 60s. The visual imagery here shows curiosity and excitement. The verb choice emphasises the chaos and humour of the situation as the children imitate the frogs. But the real catalyst for change is the revelation from a rough boy, and the adjective choice here shows her disgust. The noun dunce and the adjective rough show a much more unpleasant side of school as her identity changes from child to adolescent. The rough boy makes a revelation about sexual reproduction. He's kicked for his pains, as shown through the short sentence, "You kicked him," evoking her disbelief and her fear of the unknown. The poet suspects, well, as a child, that he is speaking the truth. It's confirmed by Mrs. Tilscher in the final stanza when she evades Duffy's question and is asked about childbirth, and the teacher's smile is a confirmation that it's time to move on. Told you were born. Again, this idea of the outside world interrupting or disrupting or encroaching on one of childlike innocence is shown, and this ruins the happiness of the child. There's growth and birth imagery. This move to adolescence is depicted as a difficult one. New information or knowledge is upsetting to the child and hard for her to come to terms with, which is of course emphasised in the verb choice and the parenthesis. Those commas, appalled. The vocabulary used is more sophisticated, charting the child's growth. Final stanza. At the end of the poem, there is another transferred epithet, feverish July. It is the child, not the month, who is feverish in July, unless we read feverish as a metaphor for the heat and humidity of the month. Note too how months are now skipped over in the passage of time. The electrical storm about to break is felt as a tangible alarm. Tangible meaning felt by touch, and it makes the child feel uncomfortable and irritable or fractious. When the reports were handed out, it is as if these are reports on childhood which has officially ended. The breaking thunderstorm is an apt metaphor for adolescence, a deluge of feelings, hormones, and changed attitudes. So in many ways, the pathetic fallacy here of the weather is one giant metaphor for coming of age and this idea of hitting puberty and everything changing. The passage of time brings with it changed feelings and perceptions. There's this sense of buzzing, dangerous excitement. There's more synesthesia with this idea that you can actually conjure up other senses. So tasting electricity, when electricity is usually something you feel. The metaphor of the storm is extended. The fact that the child is linked to the weather suggests something tempestuous is going to happen, and the rule of three furthers this. Tangible or touchable, a growing sense of sensitivity and heightened feelings. The adjective creates a strong sensory image of her state of stress and excitement, and the child perceives this kind of buzz. The diction alarm also suggests a warning of what is ahead, so impending disaster or something unpleasant. And then the sibilants and the adjectives, or pathetic fallacy, form a complex sentence that shows the child is uncomfortable in this new mental state. They're confused. The alliteration, smiled, then turned away, helps emphasise how the teacher doesn't want to ruin the child's innocence. These are things she must confront or discover herself. The ominous short dramatic sentence, reports were handed out, suggests a negative report brought back to the world of school and this universality of the experience. And as I said earlier, it's maybe that this is a metaphor for that final report on your childhood ending. There's symbolism, this idea of her running out of the gates, suggesting her transition into adolescence. The child seems to be in a hurry to grow up. The sibilance and pathetic fallacy creates a troubled tone. Life is changing in a powerful way for this child. They still have a sense of wonder and enthusiasm for life, but their mental and physical state is changing. Could the weather perhaps represent this tempestuous adolescent mood swing? The tone, there's definitely parts where there's a tone of awe, admiration, anticipation, and fear. And the themes, childhood and change.